Audio test. All right, so then I got $1 million and I was super successful, and that was it.
Hey, we putting on a show, trying to catch a vibe. We do this every time, like na 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 na. Feeling like I'm on the highway, cause everything been going my way. And now they looking at me sideways. I'm like na 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 na. This is where I wanna be, na na na. Never ever gonna leave.
Boom! Part three of the story series. So today I'm talking about what I'm going to call the entrepreneurial interest phase. So yesterday's video, I kind of ended with talking about like kind of closing down that phase of like actually running a business, a small business, and how I got this career job. Well, I'm going to blow past like a lot of history really quick, and then kind of go backwards and talk about some of it. So after that job, I worked that job for 1.5 years. I don't remember if I went into this or not, but I worked it for 1.5 years, and then I got laid off. Long story short, the county was losing like $2 million of support from the next year. So they had to let a bunch of us go. And there was like 16 of us from that Wolf Center area that got let go. Unfortunately, I was one of them. And so yeah, I had to do my own thing. I went back to working at Hollywood Video. I ended up getting a job as a youth pastor, and I actually moved up to Sacramento and then to the Bay Area, kind of, just shy of it technically, Fairfield, and then up to the mountains up in Paradise, California, RIP. I mean, there's still some people living there, but it burned down a few years ago. And then let's see, from there, then we were in Oakhurst, California. So a lot of mountain towns, a lot of stuff. But I'd gotten really into like the whole startup entrepreneur thing as like a hobby, like an interest. Like I like reading about it. It was interesting to me. And that actually started, kind of accidental. So we're at my parents' house, one night. My wife and I were hanging out, probably over for dinner. And my sister, my youngest of my two sisters, my sister goes into like some sort of seizure, and so like we don't know what's going on, right? I'm like holding her, and she's like involuntarily seizing and shaking, and she's like crying, and I'm like holding her, and called an ambulance. I didn't call the ambulance, my family did, and she gets taken to the hospital. So we all run down to the ER, and like, you know, they're seeing her, they're doing the whole intake thing, and like, so we can't just be in there. So we're like waiting in the waiting room, aptly named, and it's boring, right? And we don't have these guys to like look at Facebook and whatnot. So I'm like looking through the magazines, and it's like Better Town and Country, Poker, Guns, this, and they're all kind of boring. And I find one, and it's like Success Magazine or Entrepreneur Magazine, something like that. I'm like, oh, okay, this is kind of, you know, remotely interesting. So I'm like reading through it, and most of it's not super interesting to me because I kind of closed the door in that phase of my life and kind of thought I was done with that. And then I find this article, and I'm pretty sure, so in the last few months I heard Gary Vee talk about an article that got him into the entrepreneur thing, because he was like a wine guy, and he read this article. I've been listening to Gary Vee for years, just heard this story a couple months ago. I'm like, I swear that's the same article I read, where he read this article, and then he went to South by Southwest. He found out about this whole online thing. That's what got him to invest in like Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that. So there's this article, and it's got like just like X amount of like different young kids who started a business. I say young kids, they were like in their 20s, who started a business and then sold it for like millions of dollars, right? One of them I remember being was Xfire, and it was like the communication, you know, for like when you're gaming, you can like message and chat and stuff with each other. I'm pretty sure it's called Xfire. One of them was Kevin Rose, like that super famous article. It talked about how he started Dig, and I was like, wait, I know this guy, because I watched a lot of, we had Comcast internet at the time, well, when I was growing up, and he was on one of those shows. It wasn't a tactless show, but he was on one of those shows. So I'm like, I remember this guy. He was on that show before he ended up leaving. He was like the side guy who they'd cut to for like little clips and stuff. So I read through this article, kind of forget I'm even in the hospital. My sister ended up being fine, and whatnot. Like she was home later that night. She was just there for a couple hours. They did some tests, and they gave her an IV and hydrated her and stuff like that, and whatnot. So I read this article and it's like super interesting, right? So fast forward, like, I don't know, like a year or so. So that kind of lays the foundation. And so this whole startup thing is kind of, I'm kind of like researching and kind of keeping in on this stuff. It's just like a side hobby thing, nothing super serious. And then I'm in Paradise, California. I'm a youth pastor there. And it's Father's Day. And my wife's like, hey, what do you want for Father's Day? You're really annoyingly hard to buy for. Like, what do you want? So I was like, I want to go to the bookstore and buy some books. So I go to the bookstore and I buy these 2 books, and one is about Facebook and one is about Google. And we didn't have air conditioning, and it was like it would get hot during the summer, and this was obviously right after Father's Day. So I would then go out and lay in the hammock. I'd come home from work and I'd lay on my hammock, and there'd be a little bit of a breeze, and I'd read these books. And I was fascinated by them, about the story of how Facebook started and Google started, and just all the stuff that went into them. And I kind of became a little bit obsessed, and this became like my number one hobby was like learning about and reading about and watching interviews and stuff with like entrepreneurs. It was just so interesting to me. And I was getting great ideas even for youth ministry, and I was using the principles I was learning about of like these stories of these entrepreneurs in my youth ministry. I don't know what that is. Anyways, I think I was talking about how like I would use the different techniques. Oh, I was gonna give you the one example. So I was reading about like this designer. I don't remember actually exactly what it was. I read a couple different things or watching it. I think it was a video series I was watching, and I got the idea. I don't remember how much I copied it exactly, because the thing that I'm wanting to say I remember is that this designer had written his resume on a light bulb and sent it in, and then you like plugged it in and they turned it on and it like projected his, and then of course he got the job. But I think that I was listening to a different company. I think it was this company with these 2 girls, and they're talking about how they figured out you could ship anything. Like you could just put a packing label on it. So we ended up like shipping, we'd go and get big giant bouncy balls and write like notes to students on them, and then ship them, like not in a box. And so like they would just get these giant balls with like, and we'd write all the stuff on there, to and from information and the note and all that. And then they would just put some postage on there. They'd literally put a piece of paper, and then they would like tape it around it, and then boom, they'd ship it. And that always got students who hadn't been in a while to come back and be like, what? So that was fun. So I'd use stuff like that, right? So as Gary Vee said, I had entrepreneur tendencies. And then it started driving me crazy, because I started seeing all the inefficiencies in like the way churches and nonprofits and stuff are run. And I'd see the innovation in the way like startups were run. And it started to just like really bother me. And it got to the point where I ended up quitting. First I went to a different place, and I was like, I'm going to start fresh, and I'm going to, because it's kind of causing some problems. The stuff we were doing, it was like we were growing and it was awesome, but it was also causing friction with like the pastor and the board. And so I went to another church, and then it still was causing problems, and I was having some of the same issues. So I ended up quitting. And from there I did a lot of stuff. So I quit and I started up, I was like, hey, I'm going to start my own online business, and that failed. And then I tried a couple other things, and those all failed. And then I was like, okay, so I don't know how to sell things. Like I can teach and I can create content. I don't know how to sell things, right? So I was like, I'm going to learn how to sell. And I was like, how do I learn how to sell? How do I get the grit that I need to be able to like make it, right? And so I was like, well, one way, like how do other people who have these skills I'm looking for, how do they get it? So I'm like, well, one way is a lot of people, they go off to military after high school, and that like ages them, right? And I don't mean ages in like the old, I mean ages in like the experience, and they come back, and it's how you have like a 23-year-old or a 26-year-old or 28-year-old running $1 million like, right? It's like it gives them a maturity, gives them life experience. I'm like, well, I'm married and I have 2 kids. I can't do that. Okay, college. That's another way a lot of people do it. They go off for 4 years of college and they network and their experiences and all stuff. It's like, okay, also not gonna happen. So I'm like, what else can I do? And I was like scratching my head. I couldn't think of something. And then finally it dawned on me. I was like, car salesman. Those dudes literally have to just like every single day, multiple times a day, go through that process of taking someone who is actually less than culture, like they don't like them, right? Like they're hostile to them, and like having to try to nurture and build that relationship and then get them to buy something, and then you're gonna have to get them to spend like tens of thousands of dollars. Like if I can learn to do that, I could probably learn how to sell something. So anyways, all to say, I was like, I'm gonna do car sales for a year. I'm gonna learn, I'm gonna get better at this, and I'm gonna get over like I was really intimidated. Like even as a youth pastor, like I'd go to a campus and it was really hard for me to be like, what's the word I'm looking for? But to be like outgoing. Like I could talk and hang out, but like, I don't know. I was like very introverted. It was very hard for me to be like, hey, yeah, this is who I am, and let me just kind of like command the environment and then invite you back or any of that stuff. I was just very much unassuming. I was like, let me just stand in the back and just kind of like, it was really hard for me. And so I was like, this will help me. And it did, because like I literally, we'd stand there and someone would drive up and it'd be your turn and you'd have to like walk up to them. Typically they do not want you to talk to them. You'd have to like introduce yourself. They would tell you to go away and you basically have to say no. And then they'd want to test drive a car. And then you'd be like, okay, I need your license, your driver's license, and I need you to answer. We don't want to give you all this information. And I'm like, do it anyways. And it was this whole long, and I learned and I got a lot better. I worked at depending on how you look at it, 2 to 3 different dealerships. 2 different dealerships, but the second one, I started in the internet department, and then I moved over to first I worked at Nissan, then I went to a whole different dealership, worked in the internet department where I sold Nissans, and then like all stuff like Dodge, Ram, like just all kinds of stuff, right? And then after however long, I moved from the internet department back to the sales floor, selling Nissans. So it was almost exactly, it was like a year and a week. I said I was gonna do it for a year, and like a year and a week into it, I got fired. Not by my boss. My boss loved me, but my boss's boss, who had had enough of me. And my boss was like, I have to fire you. I don't want to, but I have to, and said his boss's name. Basically, he got mad at something I did. It was a couple things too. I butted heads with him a few times, and he was super cool about it. He was like, look, like don't tell anyone I'm telling you this, because we're not supposed to do this. But he's like, if you just go down the street, I'll call them up and give a recommendation. You'll have a job tomorrow at the other dealership. And I was like, nah, I'm good, fam. And so I was like, peace, I'm out. And I went home and I bought a laptop, and I was like, I'm an online entrepreneur. I wasn't making any money though. So I then had to start figuring it out, right? So I bought a laptop, and I went to the bookstore and I bought a magazine about how to be a freelancer. And I just started freelancing, and I was doing copywriting. I was doing mostly copywriting. There was other stuff, but that was like the one skill that I learned. Like I knew how to do video and I knew how to copyright. And at the time I had this mental block that like I couldn't do video outside of my town, because again, the internet still wasn't what it was now. So it would have been difficult. I could have still done it. It wasn't like it was impossible, but I just for some reason felt like, no, that's too much of a constraint, because I'd have to go there, and I had a mental block in it. And so what I did is like, I'll go with copyright. And that's the other skill I learned actually in youth ministry, because I kind of accidentally committed to doing a monthly newsletter, and I knew so little about it that I was like, yeah, now I have to learn how to write a newsletter. And I accidentally bought a course on copywriting instead of like doing a newsletter, and I learned how to copyright. So I started doing freelance copywriting, and I ended up getting involved with some really awesome people. I signed up for Noah Kagan's monthly 1K. It was entrepreneur course at first, but yeah, it was the monthly 1K. Met a bunch of awesome people. From there, Gideon Walker, he's a good buddy of mine, is actually just on his show last night. So if you go check the link, I'll hook that up. Was on his weekly show, Charismatic, last night. He started this thing called like After Hours, monthly 1K After Hours, and it was basically where a group of us would just get on and talk about the different things. And monthly 1K was a course. There was a Facebook group, but it was a course you'd go through, and it had you go through these different steps of learning how to start a business. And the idea was it would take you from like, I don't know, I just want to do a business, all the way up to like, you're now making $1,000 a month. And yes, we had this after hours thing that he started and was hosting, and it was going really well. And I was meeting like tons of awesome people, and like Gideon and myself and a couple of us were like regulars, and then other people just kind of cycle through, and it was great. And then it wasn't. So it got to be a little too big, and Noah basically was like, you guys can't build a business on top of my business. And we weren't actually building a business, but like we were getting big enough that it was like representing him, and it made it look like he was endorsing it. And we were kind of using that leverage as like, yeah, hire, you know. And so it was like, so he, rightfully so. I'm not like calling him out or anything. I would probably have done the same thing. And so we had to shut that down, and that was kind of depressing. But I was still talking to Nick, not Noah. I was still talking. I mean, I was still talking to Noah, but I was still talking to Gideon. And we decided to do this thing called Entrepreneur Dads, and we were working on that. So I'm talking to him every week. So I live in California, Central California at the time. He's in Nevada. He's in Las Vegas. And so like we're doing like weekly calls. And then I have this other friend named Mike Doyle, who I had made friends with because he was a client of mine. And he'd hired me to do some marketing and some copywriting stuff for him. And that evolved into like a friendship. And it went from like, we were working on the project to where we just became friends. And so I was also having weekly calls with him. It was not really, it was like a, kind of like a, I'm trying to think of the name of it, right? We weren't like mentors because we were all kind of at the same level, but we'd have these check-in calls like, how are you doing? What are you struggling with? And we'd encourage each other, we'd help each other. And it got to the point where it was just like, I'd call up Gideon and I'd be talking to him and he'd be like, yeah, I'm really struggling with this. And I was like, oh, I was just talking to my buddy Mike, and they'd never met each other, my buddy Mike about this. And I'd tell him what he said. And then like the next week I'd be talking to Mike and Mike would be like, yeah, man, I'm really struggling with this. I'm like, man, Gideon was just talking about this. This is what you need to do. Da, 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 da. This is everything he said. And then I was like, I'm literally like an operator here. Like I'm spending all my time just connecting these two. I was like, hey, I'm just going to introduce you to, we're going to get on calls together. And that's what we did. We got on these weekly calls. We took it from 2 different calls to 1 call. And so once a week, the 3 of us got on a group call and we just talked about our businesses and what was going on. And it was really good, but it was still missing something. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about in tomorrow's episode.
1, 2, 3, I don't know who else to be. 4, 5, 6, like they say I can't be fixed. 1, 2, 3, your attention's all I need. 4, 5, 6, don't let it slip. 1, 2, 3, I don't know who else to be. 4, 5, 6, like they say I can't be fixed. 1, 2, 3, your attention's all I need.